welcome to your access point to Washington. I'm Ayesha Tanzeem. Pakistan's top military man, General Ishfaq Parvez Kiani, will soon be walking the halls of Kremlin, a historic first trip by a Pakistani army chief to Russia, followed very closely by a visit of the Russian President Vladimir Putin to Islamabad. You add to it the recent trip by Pakistani President Asif Zardari to Russia, and it starts sounding like a major policy shift by the two countries. Or is it? Joining me in studios to talk about this are Shamila Chaudhary, who's with the Eurasia Group now, but until very recently was in the White House as the National Security Council Director for Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Mr. David Satter, who's a fellow with both the Hudson and the Johns Hopkins University and an expert on Russia and the former Soviet Union. And joining me and joining us all via Skype from Toronto is Kamran Bokhari, who's a Vice President and a Senior Analyst for Middle East and South Asia. Welcome to all of you. Now, let me start with you, Kamran. Is it a major policy shift, or is it just another arm-twisting tactic to show the U.S. that the countries have options?
No, I don't think that President Putin would go to the extent of, coming to Islamabad for 3 days, and this is going to be his first visit, if it was just arm-twisting. I think there's more to it. I think there is sort of what many people would call a paradigm shift on the part of, the strategic thinkers in Islamabad, where, the complete tilt towards the United States is giving way for a more diversified foreign policy menu of options.
Okay, thank you, Kamran. Mr. Satter, I'd like to come to you and also go first to a Facebook comment that we have by Mr. Muhammad Farooq, who's written that it's crucial for Pakistan to have peace and stability in Afghanistan, which Americans alone or even the US-led ISAF cannot bring about. It needs wholesome involvement of the regional powers too, of course with their full commitment, and it is in this context that the visit may be seen. Do you agree? Is it about Afghanistan or is it beyond that?
Well, it's surely about Afghanistan, because Russia has to be very worried about developments in Afghanistan once the United States leaves. Russia has a very large Muslim population, and if that population is radicalized, it will create tremendous problems for Russia's internal stability. The population of the North Caucasus is already being radicalized, because the war is being waged there. Other parts of the country are relatively quiet, but they may not stay that way. The point about the Taliban victory is that it would be an example of the power of radical Islamic ideas, which is the last thing that Russia can afford to encourage.
Okay, so basically a lot of comments on Facebook that we're getting from our viewers is Russia may be trying to help the Taliban, and it's just a theory, and you have to tell me whether it's right or wrong, because it still feels really badly. There's bad blood. America helped the Taliban to beat Russia. Why is Russia not doing that to beat US, or is it?
I can't exclude that type of emotional reaction on the part of Russia, but it would be extremely irrational if, in fact, that is a factor. My guess is that it's more a question of hoping to have some influence over the situation once the United States leaves. In the present situation, Russia's been protected by the NATO effort in Afghanistan. Russia has indeed provided some support for that effort, but they don't have to get involved themselves. In effect, their strategic interests are being defended by NATO. Well, with NATO gone, or largely gone, they have to take steps on their own to protect their strategic interests, and they understand they can't do that without Pakistan.
Okay, so Ms. Chaudhary, you work very closely with the U.S. government, or until recently you were in the White House, so that's, very close. There's a Facebook comment that suggests by Mr. Mohammad Ashfaq, yes, Pakistan is looking for more friends in the region as well as in the world by sharing the influence of USA gradually. This is a sensible policy shift, as it will increase its value in the eyes of US, who has become not a trustworthy fellow. First of all, do you agree? Is it something that will increase the value of Pakistan in the eyes of US? And how is this trip and this development being viewed in the U.S.?
Well, what we're seeing happening in the region is part of a broader geopolitical transition. We're seeing Pakistan looking at a lot of other countries besides Russia and publicly emphasizing the strategic partnerships that it has. There's been an increase in rhetoric, not just with Russia, but also China, Iran, Turkey, the UK. And they're doing this for a reason. It's because the relationship with the US has gone down. It is in decline. And they need to show people in Pakistan that there are other countries that will come to Pakistan's rescue if need be. But also, these countries are taking advantage of an opportunity. For 10 years plus, the US has assumed the dominant role in negotiating with Pakistan over economic issues, over questions of stability. And I think a lot of countries have been okay and comfortable with the US assuming that role. But now that that role is in decline, there's concern that over who will talk to Pakistan, who will manage the instability that's going on in this country. And so I think other countries are seeing this as an opportunity to increase their presence in the region, influence in Afghanistan, but also they want to manage the instability that they see happening in Pakistan. They're concerned about it.
And I will get Mr. Bokhari's opinion on that. First of all, do you agree with Ms. Chaudhary that other countries are trying to manage the instability? And also there's a Facebook comment by Mr. Jumma Muhammad Mandukhail, 2 words. Too late. Is it, Mr. Bokhari?
I think I would agree to that, but I also think that the drive is more from the Pakistani side because they're the ones in need. As she said, that the relationship with the United States is not what it used to be. They've moved beyond the whole saga that began last November with the killing of the 24 soldiers. But I think that the damage was done. And there's no walking away from that. So ultimately, Pakistan is trying to diversify. I mean, we've seen it recently with the Zardari visit to India and the courting of the Indians, hoping that the Indian Prime Minister would reciprocate. Even in Afghanistan, for the past 2 years, this government, along with the military and intelligence leadership, has been trying to move beyond just the Taliban in terms of a sphere of influence in the Western neighbor. We have the foreign minister either in Germany or about to go. I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. So we have this whole slew.
She's about to go, I think. You're right. She's either there or she's about to go. I mean, it was very close before she comes to U.S. next week.
So we have all these new relationships that are being cultivated. So yes, I think it's from both sides. But I would definitely say that the need for Pakistan is greater than for those on the outside.
Okay, Mr. Satter, this visit, not the General Kiani visit, the visit by President Putin will also coincide with a quadrilateral summit, which includes Pakistan, Russia, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. They're going to sit down, talk about the situation in the region. What do you think is the most important issue that the 4 presidents need to talk about?
Well, they need to talk about stability in Afghanistan, and all of those countries are in one way or another threatened by a Taliban victory. Tajikistan has a practically non-existent army. Kyrgyzstan, it's the same situation. If the Taliban is victorious, even if the radical Islamic presence in those countries is not as great as it is elsewhere, it will energize that presence, and the local armed forces are absolutely no match for the battle-hardened Taliban under those circumstances. So they all really have to worry about what's going to happen once NATO leaves, and I think that will be one of the subjects of conversation.
So, Ms. Chaudhary, let me bring a subject that America is very fond of, which is the Haqqani group. Will the other presidents be putting some of the same pressures on Pakistan that U.S. puts, or do you think their interests are separate and they don't view situation from the same lens?
I think the pressure will be a little different, or not a little different, significantly different. the emphasis on the Haqqani network is mostly coming from the United States, and that's for obvious reasons. Attacks on U.S. interests in Afghanistan that go back to the Haqqani network have intensified in the past year. There have been huge attacks. I mean, the embassy was attacked. Camp Salerno was attacked. The frequency and intensity have increased. So these are clearly U.S. interests in kind of pushing, against the Haqqani network much harder. There's still significant debate, I think, in the broader counterterrorism community within the U.S. and also outside of the U.S. over how damaging the Haqqani network will be for the long term for U.S. interests in Afghanistan. I've said this many times, you can't kill the Haqqani network away, you can't kill the Taliban away, you can't even designate them away. They will be there as a political force to be reckoned with post-2014. And so I think other countries will have a role in making that point, that these are folks that have to be negotiated with whether we like it or not.
So, Mr. Bokhari, what will be a success? What will Pakistan term as a successful visit, and what will Russia term as a successful visit?
Well, from the Pakistani point of view, clearly they want a better relationship. The visit, they're looking forward to not just having a consensus, a regional Central Asian consensus of which Pakistan should be a part of on Afghanistan. Islamabad is also looking for bilateral relations with the Russians, with Moscow. There are lots of things. There's a lot of money that Moscow has at present to invest. The question is, will they invest in Pakistan? Pakistan has lots of problems. In the past, in the 70s, the Soviet Union helped build the steel mill in Karachi. And so something along those lines is also an expectation on the part of the Pakistani leadership. Other than that, I think that if the Pakistanis can move beyond the 90s strategic balance in the region, where Russia, Tajikistan, India, and Iran were backing the Northern Alliance, while the Pakistanis and the Saudis and the Emiratis were backing the Taliban, if that can somehow change to where Pakistan is not just seen as a backer of the Taliban, but has a more diversified sphere of influence in its Western neighbor as well as in the region beyond, then I think that would be success for the Pakistanis. As far as the Russians are concerned, I will agree with my colleague from Hudson that the fear on the part of the Kremlin is that they have a very large Muslim population, where recently we're seeing a lot of eruptions, not just in the Caucasus or Central Asia, but in Tatarstan, which has been relatively peaceful and a much more stable entity where there's a lot of energy reserves, and it's a very modernized and advanced republic. And so the fear of the Russians is that somehow whatever is going to go down in post-NATO Afghanistan should not cross the borders and disturb the balance that exists in the areas of the former Soviet Union, okay. Essentially the Kremlin's near abroad.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Sutter, I read in the news, of the trip is that Pakistan is trying now, its relationships with Russia are very limited in terms of military and strategic cooperation. What kind of military cooperation is this trip going to try and achieve?
That's an interesting question. There was never any military cooperation between Pakistan and Russia. On the contrary, Pakistan facilitated the American war against the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. And it's also not clear what Pakistan's military objectives would be in a post-2014 Afghanistan. The real concern on the part of Russia is the Pakistani nuclear arsenal and what's likely to happen to it, and Pakistan's possible role in proliferating nuclear weapons. That's a subject that may well come up because that reflects their real interests. They don't. Russia tries to sell its arms, which are becoming less and less competitive, to a lot of countries. It's possible they may try to sell some to Pakistan if relations get better. Whether that would be an important part in the relationship or not is very doubtful, I think.
Mr. Bokhari, you want to jump in since you do a lot of strategy and you manage and analyze it and the situation. General Kiani is going there, Chief of the Army Staff. What kind of military cooperation Pakistan is intending to develop with Russia?
Thus far, the Pakistanis have been recipient of largely American weaponry. And that's not been forthcoming. The relationship over the past 10 years and the tensions have taken a toll on that. And I get the sense that the stakeholders, both the civil and the military stakeholders in Islamabad, are trying to sort of mimic the Indian approach on defense in terms of procurements, where the Indians buy weapons from pretty much everybody, from the United States to the Brits to the French to the Russians. So I think that the Pakistanis are looking at that, especially when American weaponry is not easy to acquire these days, given the state of relations and, of course, the state of the Pakistani economy itself. So I think that would be very much of interest. And obviously, post-NATO Afghanistan is where there could be some sort of cooperation, because the Pakistanis, have come a long way from the 90s, where a Taliban government in Kabul was a good thing for the Pakistanis. Anymore, it's pretty much threatening the stability of the country, given the insurgency that rages within Islamabad's own borders.
Okay, so Ms. Chaudhary, a lot of people, our viewers on Facebook, seem to think Russia, America, antagonism. In this case, Russia is going to try and fund the TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, which the U.S. also wants, rather than the Iran-Pakistan pipeline, and the stability in the region. Does it seem to be an area where the interests of Russia and U.S. are converging?
I have to agree. I mean, it's easy. The easier answer is to say no, but I have to agree, because the U.S. has been bogged down in South Asia for 10 years, over 10 years now, and they are looking for other stakeholders, whether it's countries in the region or outside of the region, to assume more responsibility for not just the security situation, but also economic development, investments, all kinds of opportunities. They're encouraging the Indians to go into Afghanistan, which I know is very controversial, but yet they're doing it. It's very important. And so the U.S. doesn't want to be seen as leaving South Asia in an economic mess. And so I think that's exactly where the interests converge.
And Mr. Sutter, I read something very interesting, which is that Pakistan wants to deal with Russia government to government in terms of energy projects. There seemed to be a very high-level delegation coming with the Russian president to Islamabad. They'll be signing a lot of MOUs. There'll be a lot of projects going back and forth. Is it just something that they don't want to deal with private companies and want to do stuff government to government? Is there a reason for that?
Well, the major Russian energy companies are all state-controlled anyway. So the distinction between private companies and non-private in the Russian case is very tenuous. Gazprom, which is, I believe, the main negotiator, is a wholly state-controlled company. And I think that those energy links also depend on stability in the region.
Exactly. And if there's no stability,
first of all, they become totally unrealistic, and they don't provide any sort of incentive to either side.
So, Mr. Bokhari, since stability seems to be the big theme here, Russia wants it, Pakistan wants it, US wants it, probably China and some other countries also want it. What is it that these countries can do together? What is it that they're doing together? And where is it that their interests are not meeting? Because we've seen that with US and Pakistan, the interests are not converging on some points. Where is it that Russia's interest with Pakistan or with US are not converging in Afghanistan?
I think the Russian example is one where this is just beginning. This is the beginning of a potential relationship. So we don't really know how far that will go. We don't know, what will be the outcome. Certainly, we have President Putin coming in for 3 days to Islamabad, so that's a good start. But everything will depend upon the trust that is developed, and it's not developed in one visit or a few visits. It takes time. So obviously, there are concerns already, and there is that diversion of interests. The Russians are coming in and saying, okay, so what is your end game that you're envisioning for Afghanistan? Does that track with what we want to see happen? And so what I'm trying to say here is that to begin with, there is this sort of default position where there is a divergence. Can there be a convergence? Well, time will tell. I'd like to take a minute to address the issue of the TAPI pipeline. One of the problems with that pipeline, despite the fact that the United States prefers it over the IPI, and understandably so, the problem is it runs through Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is the issue. And it's going to be the issue for many, many years to come. Stability will be, elusive, to put it mildly. So, how does one build that pipeline, secure it, such that the natural gas is supplied to the end receivers? So, I just don't see that happening, and I think that is why the Pakistanis are looking at the Iran pipeline, because it doesn't run through Afghanistan. And the Iranian side of that pipeline is already built. So from the Pakistani point of view, they think that that's much more feasible. The question is, how much more juice can the Russians put into this, or for that matter, the Americans, to make it possible.
They probably also have to make a calculation, and Ms. Chaudhary, you might want to add to that. They probably also have to make a calculation of the loss in terms of, they might have to stop doing business with major U.S. companies and U.S. banks if they go through with that pipeline. Secretary of State has said, shovel hits the ground, the sanctions hit, and boom, there goes not just the U.S. government, but also private U.S. companies, a lot of textile imports. How big of an impact can it be on Pakistani private companies and the government?
I think it's actually a much bigger issue now than it was, say, even a few years ago, simply because the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan is so bad, and the mood in Washington, just amongst Congress, is terrible, that the U.S. government is less likely to overlook certain things in order to continue counterterrorism cooperation with Pakistan. So, in the past, the U.S. has conveyed displeasure with the Iran pipeline, but I think that displeasure will be, they'll heighten their concerns as we move forward into the future.
Okay, so we're talking about what Pakistan needs, what Pakistan wants, what Afghanistan wants. What does Russia want in the region? And what is it, 3 days, Russian president, big deal. Why is Russia putting that time and energy into this?
Well, Russia is a power that is always seeking to expand its influence and its world prestige. It still suffers from the psychological after effects of the fall of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a country which made its impact felt in every corner of the world. It was truly a superpower. Russia is nothing comparable. It has half the population and half the wealth, half an economy that's half the size. It's just simply not in a position to do what the Soviet Union did. And nonetheless, the mentality of people doesn't change that quickly. And Russia's always looking for an opportunity to convince itself that it's still a great power, that the world is ready to consider Russia's wishes, and best of all, the world's a little bit afraid of Russia. So anytime they see an opportunity to expand their influence, they'll of course take it. The fact remains that in this particular situation involving Afghanistan, Russia's best interest, and Russians are aware of it, are the same as those of the United States: a stable and non-extremist regime in Afghanistan.
Mr. Bokhari, I want to take what Dr. Satcher said and add to it, and I'll just throw in a Facebook comment. Adil Avan says on Facebook, to control the influence of U.S. and other powers in this region, we must think to make something special with Russia. Other people on Facebook says, well, this is a good thing. We can now, ward off U.S. Even if this relationship develops, would it actually, how much of an impact would it have with Pakistan's relationship with U.S.?
I don't think that the Pakistanis are trying to substitute, the United States with Russia. I doubt that is happening. I don't think that's on the mind of anybody. I think it's more of diversification, having more options. And I'd like to add that from the Russian point of view, Pakistan represents another country with which the Kremlin can create problems for Washington. I mean, along the lines of what's happening in Syria, although that's an extreme case right now, similar to what the Russian leverage over Iran, and it uses it as a geopolitical card to deal with the United States and extract benefits on other issues, particularly the Baltics and Eastern Europe. I think that's kind of a similar arrangement that the Kremlin is looking to develop with Islamabad, so it can be used as another bargaining chip with the United States. What does that mean for Pakistan? Well, it means that Pakistan has very little room to maneuver because it will be the smaller partner and dependent upon the extent to which the Russians are willing to do business with them. The question is,
which is the same with U.S. Pakistan's the smaller partner and is always complaining of not getting an equal treatment, but that's hard in international politics when you have a big and a small partner. But Ms. Chaudhary, let me throw in something else. How's India viewing this?
Well, I think that India is viewing this with caution, no doubt. I mean, it historically has had the better relationship with the Russians. And even though Russian defense sales to Pakistan are not very likely or not in the immediate scheme of things, they remain a possibility. And I think that area in particular is where India is going to be concerned. Whether India likes it or not, Pakistan is in this sort of competition with India to match Indian conventional capabilities when it comes to military equipment, and it's probably
beat them in nuclear weapons.
And beat them in nuclear weapons. And if you do the math, it's probably never going to be possible. But all of these military relationships with other countries offer Pakistan the opportunity to strike a balance with India, whether it's real or imagined. It doesn't really matter. It's a strategic move.
Perceptions, reality.
Yes.
This day, towards the end, but I'll give each of you a minute to say, how do you think is India viewing this, and how should India view it, Mr. Sutter?
I'm not a specialist on India-Pakistani relations, but India is a historic ally of Russia, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, India began to diversify its sources of arms and began to rely much more on a relationship with the United States, particularly after September 11th. So anything which strengthens Pakistan and the Indians are also well aware of the opportunistic nature of Russian foreign policy. And having dealt with Russia for many years during the Cold War, they cannot be unaware that Russia will not be concerned about India's interests if, in fact, they think they can get some advantage from dealing with Pakistan.
Mr. Bokhari, how is India viewing this? How should it view it?
I think that the Indians are not that worried just yet, but they could be. It all depends upon what kind of business relationship develops between the Kremlin and the Pakistanis. Keep in mind that from the Russian point of view, it is not really appreciative of India leaning heavily towards the United States and the West. So this is one way of bringing India back into the fold, and it gives them some leverage and say, okay, we won't do business with the Pakistanis, but you got to give us something in return. So we won't give them Sukhoi jets and other hardware, but you have to do more business with us, and we really don't like the U.S. influence. So there's a lot of games going on around here. But to put it in succinctly, I would say that right now the Indians are looking at this and scratching their head and saying, what are the Pakistanis up to? They're warming up to us. They're warming up to the Afghans, particularly the people from the former Northern Alliance, and now they're going to Russia. So what's going on over here? Is this for real, or is this maneuvering, as you asked in the beginning, Ayesha?
Okay, thank you very much, Kamran. We're in our last minute, so before we end, let me thank all of you. David Sutter, again, a fellow with both the Hudson Institute and Johns Hopkins. I'm very impressed. Shamila Chaudhary, of course, who was recently with the White House, Director of Pakistan and Afghanistan at the National Security Council. And Kamran Bokhari, who joined us from Toronto. He's always very generous with his time, although I know how busy he is. He's with Stratfor, Vice President. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us, and thank you all for joining us. Please join us on Facebook and give your comments about this show. Leave your comments and questions about the next show. Also give us any topics that you want us to cover. We'll come back. Hina Rabbani Kar, Pakistan's foreign minister, is coming to US. Maybe we'll talk about that. Keep checking on our Facebook page, facebook.com/accesspointwithAT. And good night. First to a Facebook comment that we have by Mr. Muhammad Farooq, who's written that it's crucial for Pakistan to have peace and stability in Afghanistan, which Americans alone or even the US-led ISAF cannot bring about. It needs wholesome involvement of the regional powers too, of course with their full commitment, and it is in this context that the visit may be seen. Do you agree? Is it about Afghanistan or is it beyond that?
Well, it's surely about Afghanistan because Russia has to be very worried about developments in Afghanistan once the United States leaves. Russia has a very large Muslim population, and if that population is radicalized...
Studios to talk about this are Shamila Chaudhary, who's with the Eurasia Group now, but until very recently was in the White House as the National Security Council Director for Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Mr. David Sutter, who's a fellow with both the Hudson and the Johns Hopkins University and an expert on Russia and the former Soviet Union. And joining me and joining us all via Skype from Toronto is Kamran Bokhari, who's a vice president and a senior analyst for Middle East and South Asia. Welcome to all of you. Now, let me start with you, Kamran. Is it a major policy shift or is it just another arm-twisting tactic? Hello and welcome to your access point to Washington. I'm Ayesha Tanzeem. Pakistan's top military man, General Ishfaq Parvez Kiani, will soon be walking the halls of Kremlin, a historic first trip by a Pakistani army chief to Russia, followed very closely by a visit of the Russian President Vladimir Putin to Islamabad. You add to it the recent trip by Pakistani President Asif Zardari to Russia, and it starts sounding like a major policy shift by the two countries. Or is it? Joining me
it will create tremendous problems for Russia's internal stability. The population of the North Caucasus is already being radicalized because the war is being waged there. Other parts of the country are relatively quiet, but they may not stay that way. The point about the Taliban victory is that it would be an example of the power of radical Islamic ideas, which is the last thing that Russia can afford to encourage.
Okay, so basically a lot of to show the US that the countries have options.
No, I don't think that President Putin would go to the extent of, coming to Islamabad for 3 days, and this is going to be his first visit, if it was just arm twisting. I think there's more to it. I think there is sort of what many people would call a paradigm shift on the part of, the strategic thinkers in Islamabad, where, the complete tilt towards the United States is giving way for a more diversified foreign policy menu of options.
Okay, thank you, Kamran. Mr. Sutter, I'd like to come to you and also go